Lights, camera, action. Take 2. Methods of persuasion. Didn't we just talk about persuasion? Ah, yes. But this is chapter 17 of Dr. Lucas's public speaking textbook, The Art of Public Speaking, 13th edition. I am Dr. Heidi. Welcome back to my basement studio. And we're going to talk about the methods of persuasion. This is different than the persuasive chapter that we talked about in chapter 16. Why? Because I'm going to teach you a little bit about the methods used to persuade people. So the methods that we use, we want to make sure that we build credibility, we use evidence, we make logical reasoning, and we appeal to the emotions of the folks in the audience. First, the credibility is the perception of the speaker's competence and character. I hope by now that you feel that I have competence and character and that I am an expert of sorts in public speaking. I don't know that there are many people who are better experts than me, but they might be out there. I, though, am just convincing you that during these presentations that I've been giving to you, during the teaching that I've been doing, that I am a credible source. Ethos was Aristotle's name for credibility. Why is it mentioned here in this public speaking textbook? Well, because Aristotle was a public speaker, and you'll probably hear about ethos, pathos, and logos in other classes. Ethos is Aristotle's word for credibility. The initial credibility that you have is what you have before the speech. The derived credibility is produced during the speech, and terminal credibility is what you have at the end of the speech. When you want to enhance your credibility, first you could explain your competence, establish common ground with the audience, and then speak expressively and with conviction. People will feel that you are more credible if you sound like you know what you're talking about.
Yes.
Logos is Aristotle's name for logical appeals. This includes providing evidence and reasoning. I heard a lady who worked in George W. Bush's administration talk about evidence and reasoning. And she said they always used to say, on our money, it says in God we trust. So, in God we trust. All others bring data. So in other words, she wasn't trusting you unless you could prove your point with evidence and reasoning. Evidence is supporting materials used to prove or disprove something. Tips for using evidence. Use specific evidence, use novel evidence, use credible evidence, and make clear the points of the evidence that you are presenting. Reasoning is drawing a conclusion based on the evidence that you have presented. There are types of reasoning: specific instances, reasoning from specific instances, reasoning from principle, causal reasoning, and analogical reasoning. Reasoning from specific instances, moving from particular facts to a general conclusion. A specific instances example here is, my PE course last term was easy. My roommate's PE course was easy. My brother's PE course was easy. Therefore, PE courses are easy. I don't agree that PE courses are easy, so I might actually do a different kind of comparison. But that's okay. Let's take a look at specific instance guidelines. You want to avoid hasty generalizations. In other words, don't come to a quick conclusion just because this happened, and this happened doesn't mean that this is the answer. Like in the PE course example, I don't think physical education classes are easy. I don't care what everybody else said. They might have been easy for them, but they're not easy for me. You want to qualify your argument when necessary. Say that those 3 people whose PE courses were easy they were already physically fit. Then you might be qualifying your argument when necessary. You want to reinforce your argument with statistics and testimony. Remember, not too many statistics or it will bore people, and use good testimonies to draw people in. Reasoning from principle is moving from a general principle to a specific conclusion. This is an example that you will find in just about every textbook available. The major premise is all people are mortal. The minor premise is Socrates is a person, and the conclusion is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. I might actually talk about Socrates in public speaking class because I can tell you how old the discipline of communication is. Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, they used communication and studied communication to teach people things. Imagine that. Reasoning from principle guidelines. Use the major premise listeners will accept. In other words, all people are mortal. That's a premise people will accept. And then provide evidence for the minor premise. So start with something you all agree on, and then you can add some more information. Again, we have this word causal reasoning. Remember, it's not casual, it's causal. We are talking about a cause and effect relationship here. So you want to establish the relationship between the causes and effects. A causal reasoning example. Because that patch of ice was there, I fell and broke my arm. Maybe you fell and broke your arm for another reason, but slipping on the ice is definitely a good one. Causal reasoning guidelines. Avoid the fallacy of false cause, and do not assume events have only one cause. An example that I often use in my classes is lung cancer. People assume that you can get lung cancer from, that's right, secondhand smoke. But there are actually other ways people get lung cancer. So you can't automatically assume that just because a person has lung cancer, that means that they were a smoker. That's not exactly how it works. So make sure that you aren't using the fallacy of false cause and that you don't assume that events have only one cause. Then there's analogical reasoning. This is comparing two similar cases. What is true for the first case is also true for the second case. And in this, cases must be essentially alike. An example of analogical reasoning. If you're good at tennis, you will probably be good at ping pong. In my PE class in college, we had tennis and badminton. They are essentially or similar things that we could compare through analogical reasoning. These are the fallacies that we've been discussing. What is a fallacy? It's when the reasoning doesn't really make sense. The information that you're presenting is like, ooh, that's illogical. I don't know if those things really go together. So what are some of the fallacies? Hasty generalization is coming to a conclusion too quickly. Just because things seem to go together doesn't mean that they definitely go together. A false cause. Did the cause really come from that effect? Or is it something else? Using an invalid analogy. In other words, the things aren't really alike. Just because apples and oranges are both fruits doesn't mean that they're that much alike. A bandwagon fallacy is one that's used very often. Just because everybody else is doing it, you should do it too. This is the one they used in my high school. I grew up in a small town, and it was popular to drink beer. Everybody else is drinking beer. Come on, Heidi, drink beer. Let's not think about or talk about the fact that the beer that they were drinking tastes like crap because it was cheap. Come on, Heidi. Everybody else is going to this party and drinking alcohol. You should come too. Yeah, because I really want a police arrest on my record or a minor in possession, or I want to pay that minor in possession fine. I don't think so. Bandwagon is definitely a reasoning fallacy. Then there's red herring. Now, Red herring comes from when they actually used to smoke the fish herring and leave it in different places so that the mounted police could not follow the criminals as they were running away. It also was a deterrent for fox and other animals that were used, maybe hounds, other animals that were used for following criminals. So they threw red herring everywhere to get them off the trail. Red herring is just blaming things on something that isn't actually true. If any of you ever watched a pub named Scooby-Doo, I know I'm getting a little old, so you can actually just look it up on YouTube, but a pup named Scooby-Doo is when they had kids, and Fred always blamed everything on a guy called Red Herring. Was Red Herring the one who was actually responsible? I would say no. In fact, 99% of the time, it wasn't Red Herring's fault. So, Red Herring is also a reasoning fallacy. There are a few more reasoning fallacies that we should cover. Ad hominem, either or, slippery slope, appeal to tradition, and appeal to novelty. Either or is when we offer you one option or the other option, not the multiple options that are available. This happens often in United States elections. People are told for presidential candidates we have either the Democrat or the Republican. If you've ever been to vote, you know that there are a lot more choices for president and vice president than just the ones sponsored by the National Republican Party or the National Democratic Party. A slippery slope is when you think or insinuate that things just add up. Appeal to tradition is saying, well, we've always done it that way, so we should continue to do it that way. When my grandpa, who has a PhD in mathematics, was given the appeal to tradition argument, he did not necessarily agree. As a mathematician, he started out using the slide rule, then he was introduced to calculators, and then computers. And people said, oh my gosh, if you give the students a calculator, then they won't actually have to do any work to learn their mathematics. And even worse was the computer. Oh my gosh, if you give students a computer to do their calculations, they'll never learn anything in mathematics. My grandpa, however, did a bit of this appeal to novelty. Now you have to be careful, remember, because this can be a reasoning fallacy when you say new things are automatically better. But his way of doing it was to write an entire math textbook full of story problems. Then they actually had to use their logic to figure out the mathematical problem to enter into the calculator or the computer. Well, I'm just glad I didn't have to take a math class using his math textbooks, because story problems are not my favorite. We're going to quickly run through these again. Hasty generalization is jumping to conclusions based on insufficient evidence. False cause is mistakenly assuming that because one event follows another, the first event causes the second. Invalid analogy, the two cases being compared are not essentially alike. That's what makes it a fallacy. Bandwagon, because something is good and popular, it is good or correct. Red herring, irrelevant issue diverting attention from the actual subject. Ad hominem is attacking a person rather than dealing with the real issue. Either or is forcing a choice between two alternatives when more than two exist. A slippery slope is assuming that the first step will lead to later steps that can't be prevented. An example of a slippery slope: now that everyone is texting, posting on social media, and sending video messages, it's only a matter of time before people forget how to write complete sentences and the whole English language falls apart. That's definitely a slippery slope. Appealing to tradition is assuming something old is automatically better than something new. And appealing to novelty is assuming that something new is automatically better than something old. We also have emotional appeals. So I don't think it's been mentioned, but first was ethos. That is Aristotle's word for ethics or credibility. Pathos is emotional appeals. And logos is logical appeals. So our next slide is actually, I believe, going to say pathos. But appeals intended to evoke sadness, anger, happiness, and pride are emotional appeals. Pathos is Aristotle's name for the emotional appeal. Appealing to people's emotion, you want to use emotional language, develop vivid examples, and speak with sincerity and conviction. Ethical emotional appeals should make it appropriate to the topic, and you don't want to substitute emotional appeals for evidence and reasoning. As we find at the end of the presentational aids, in many of these chapters, there is a sample speech. I'm going to quickly address the use of emotional appeals. You can use emotions positively or negatively. Now you're wondering, how do we use them positively? Well, if you remember, your school has school colors, it has a school mascot, and it wants you to buy into the colors, the mascot, a sense of pride. We are the rebels. We are the Wildcats. And you wear the colors, you show up at athletic events, you use those when you're participating in other competitions. It is school pride, the pride you have in your school and your community. That's a positive emotional appeal. A negative emotional appeal might be something like, there are starving children in Africa. Now remember, Africa's a continent, not a country. But I bet you've all heard that there are starving children in Africa and you should eat your food because we could give this food to the starving children in Africa. I never quite figured out how my food that I didn't want to eat on my plate when I was a kid was going to get all the way to Africa to feed those kids. But it was the emotional appeal my parents were making. Happy, sad, emotional appeals. Methods of persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos. It is the way to get the job done and appeal to other people. Persuade them to do something.